How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Mem Gimel, Daf 43 of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, on Daf 43 we start with a new Mishnah. That Mishnah discusses the Pigul exceptions. We're going to have a whole long list of things that if you eat them in some theoretical Pigul scenario, you would not be chayiv kares. It would not be considered Pigul. That is the first order of business on Daf Mem Gimel of Masechta Zevachim. The Gemara begins discussing when a kometz falls from the mizbeach, which really is based on kind of essentially where the direction that the Gemara goes in, while discussing a kometz in the context of Pigul. Section 3 out of 4 is when a tamei person eats kodashim meat, kind of scenarios around that, kind of determining what exactly we're talking about. We're talking about a tamei person eating kodashim, tar kodashim meat. We're talking about a tar person eating tamei kodashim meat. I feel like we have had similar discussions in the past. We will visit that once again today. And finally, when a tamei person eats terumah or meiser, that will be the final section of today's daf. So friends, this is what we have in store for Daf Mem Gimel of Masechta Zevachim. Let's do this. Friends, we are going to begin on Daf Mem Beis, Amid Beis. 2 lines from the bottom at the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Ve'elu dvarim she'ein chayavin aleh mishum pigul. These are the things that you are not chayav for pigul. Kometz, v'aktoris, v'alvona, etc., 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 etc. Friends, who could tell me what's a classic example of pigul? Who wants to give me an example of a classic example of pigul? Well, for example, you have a korban. I don't know, some korban shlam, and it's slaughtered with the intention that the meat is going to be eaten 3 days from now. It's too late. At a time that's too late. Alternatively, that the emurim, the parts that need to be burned on the mizbeach, are going to be burned on the mizbeach tomorrow. Also, too late. So that's a classic example of pigul, right? And korban is slaughtered with the intention of eating the meat or burning the emurim after, beyond the scope of time that these things are allowed, that these activities are allowed to be done. Now, what is important and what's interesting about both of these activities, which activities? Emurim, burning the emurim, or eating the meat, those are dvarim sheyesh lehem matirin. What does that mean? Well, we've been discussing recently, for example, right, being right yikariv hamatir, right? We've discussed how the zrikas hadam, once the zrikas hadam has been complete, that allows the korban to proceed, so to speak. That allows the emurim to then be burnt on the mizbeach. It allows the meat then to be eaten either by the kohanim or the owners, depending on the korban. If we're talking about a shlomim, it's both. Right, part goes to the kohanim, part goes to the owners. So the meat that will be eaten, as well as the emurim that are going to be burnt on the mizbeach, both are things that need to be permitted. Prior to the zrikas hadam, they are not permitted. Prior to the zrikas hadam, the emurim cannot yet be burnt on the mizbeach. The meat cannot yet be eaten. Okay, so that there is a critical details, a critical part of pigul, that what you will be chayav kares for eating is something that had to have been permitted. Right? If a korban is pigul, right, a person slaughters a korban shlom with the intention of either burning the emurin chutz lizmanum or eating the meat chutz lizmanum, so that would be pigul. After the zrikas hadam becomes pigul. So if at that point you either eat the meat, right, after having this machshava and after doing zukas dam, you then eat the meat, you're chayiv karis. Alternatively, even if you eat the emurim, you are chayiv karis, because both the emurim, the parts that are burnt to the mizbeach, as well as the meat of the korban, are things that had to have been permitted by the zrikas adam, as opposed to some of the examples that we already mentioned. The kometz. What's a kometz? By a korban mincha, you have flour, you mix it with oil, and as we've discussed, the kometz process by a korban mincha is kineged kilu. It's like the shchita process by a animal korban, right? Just like by an animal, of course, there's shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika. By a mincha, there's kmitza, nesina bakli, holacha, haktara, burning on the mizbeach. So that kometz, that fistful of flour that will then be burnt on the mizbeach, that isn't something that is eaten. It's not something that you're supposed to burn on the mizbeach. So, meaning, after you burn the kometz on the mizbeach, the shiarei mincha, whatever is left over from the flour offering, is able to be eaten by the kohanim. So the burning of the kometz allows the rest of the mincha to be eaten, and if a person burnt the kometz with the intention of eating the shiarei mincha, the rest of it, chutz lizmano, so then you would be chayiv karis for eating the shiarei ha-mincha. But we're not talking about the shiarei mincha, we're talking about the kometz. The kometz is not something that becomes permitted. It's something that is meant to be burnt, which then permits the shiarei mincha to be eaten. But the kometz itself is not ever a matirin, right? It's not something that becomes permitted. Ve'aktoris, also burning incense, that's not something that becomes permitted to be eaten. Va'lavona, also frankincense, right? That's also something that's burned. It's not something that becomes permitted. Uminchas kohanim, the korban mincha of a priest, of a kohen. So if a kohen says, I'm going to bring a korban mincha, no kometz is taken from his offering, his mincha offering. A minchas kohanim, the entire mincha is simply burned on the mizbeach. So therefore, minchas kohanim is not something that becomes permitted. Uminchas kohen Mashiach, the minchas chavitin of the kohen gadol, every single day, the kohen gadol would bring a flour offering in the morning and in the afternoon. That was called the minchas chavitin. So that as well was entirely burnt. It's not something that became permitted in any kind of way. Ve'adam, the blood of the korban. The blood of the korban also does not become permitted at any point. Therefore, none of these things listed so far would be pigul. If one eats them, then you will not. Then they would not be chayiv for pigul. Now, eating blood, of course, is chayiv kares for eating blood, but you wouldn't be chayiv for eating pigul. Says Reb Meir, if one were to bring nisachim on their own. So, for example, if somebody could say, I'm going to bring to the Beis HaMikdash wine to be poured on the mizbeach. He can do that. Alternatively, right, let's say a korban shlamim, part of the korban shlamim experience, so to speak, is nisachim, minchas nisachim. Right? There was a korban mincha that was brought together with the korban shlamim. There was also wine libations. Now, technically speaking, you can bring, or you can offer the korban shlamim today and only get to the nisachim the next day, or even 10 days later, they say, right, out of Sarah Yomim. So says Reb Meir, look, if the nisachim are being brought together with the korban shlamim, so then the shlamim would be matir the nisachim to then be offered. So in that case, Reb Meir would say that the nisachim would be considered something that has a matirin, and there would be pigul if the shlamim was chutz zmano was pigul, so then the nisachim would also be. However, if the nisachim are being brought as a standalone, let's say somebody says, I'm going to bring wine to the Beis HaMikdash, for example, to be poured on the mizbeach. well then there would be no pigul for that because there's nothing to be matir that wine. The Chacham say even when nisachim are brought together with the korban, still the pigul would not be shaykh to the nisachim, because again, since you could technically, you don't have to bring them with the korban, right? You could bring them separately or another day. So therefore, the Chacham say it's not considered like the korban is permitting the nisachim in any way. Log shemen shel mitzora. As part of the purification of a mitzora, on the 8th day when he brings his korban asham, etc. So their blood of the asham would be put on the mitzora's ears and thumbs and toes. And after that, there would be some olive oil. Some olive oil would be sprinkled in the Beis HaMikdash and then applied to the ears and thumbs and of the mitzora on top of where the blood was. So now, log shemet shel mitzora. So when it comes to that log, so here's the thing: that log, the oil, is only that the oil part of the mitzora purification is only post the asham, right? You can't put the oil on the mitzora's ears and stuff before the asham. You first have to do the asham, and that allows the oil to then be brought. And the question is it considered like the asham is being matir the oil? So Reb Shimon Omer ein chayav an olav mishum pigul. So Reb Shimon says, no, we wouldn't consider that the asham is being matir the oil. It's not going to be pigul. Reb Meir Omer chayav an olav mishum pigul. Whereas Reb Meir says, no, Reb Pigul is shaykh for the oil of a mitzvah. Shedama asham matiro, because after all, it's the blood of the asham that then allows the oil to be brought by the mitzvah. If by a mitzvah oil was applied to the mitzvah without having brought a korban asham, it doesn't work. You have to first bring the korban asham, and that allows the oil to then be brought. So therefore, Reb Meir holds that there is pigul by the oil of a mitzvah. V'chol sheyesh lo matirin, and this is what we've been saying. Anything that is permitted, for example, like we've been talking about the meat of the korban or the emurim of the korban. So bein la'adam bein la'mizbeach, whether we're talking about that it's something that became permitted for people to eat, like the meat of a korban, or for the mizbeach, for example, the emurim. Chayav and olav mishum pigul. You'll be chayav for pigul. So the things that you're chayav karis for eating them, if it's pigul, are things that become permitted. Like, of course, if you eat the meat of a korban that is pigul, or you eat the emurim of a korban that is pigul. Ha'ola. Now we're going to give a few examples. A korban ola. What's permitted about a korban ola? Dama matir es b'sar lemizbeach. The zrikas adam of a korban ola then allows the meat to be burnt on the mizbeach. Of course, the korban ola is entirely burnt on the mizbeach. So once zrikas adam has been done, the meat is now permitted to be burnt on the mizbeach. Ve'orel kohanim. It also allows the hide to go to the kohanim. Right? The kohanim get the hide of the korban ola. Ola sa'of. When it comes to a bird ola offering that is entirely burnt on the mizbeach, dama matir as bisara la mizbeach. So once the blood of the ola sa'of has been applied to the mizbeach, that allows it to then be burnt on the mizbeach. So if you eat that bird, you'll be chayiv kares for pigul. Chata sa'of dama matir as bisara l'kayanim. A korban chatas of a bird, right, a bird chatas offering, is eaten entirely by the kohanim. No part of it actually goes on the mizbeach. So if that bird was pigul, so they would be chayav for eating the meat of the bird. Parim anisofim musirim anisofim, inner chataos. Right, parim davashal tzibor, for example. Seir avodah zarah. Daman matiras a mureyan likarev. So the zrikas adam by chatos apnimi. Of course, nobody's eating chatos apnimi. They're brought, but the meat is burnt by the beis hadeshin. However, burning by the beis hadeshin is not going to be considered pigul. It's not considered achilas adam or achilas mizbeach. However, there are a murim. There are parts of the korban that are burnt on the mizbeach. So the zrikas adam by chatos apnimios allows the emurim to then be burnt on the mizbeach. And therefore, they could be pigul by those emurim. Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon kol she'eino ha-mizbeach achitzon kishlamim ein chayv nalav mishum pigul. We learn pigul from the pasuk, but the pasuk that we learn pigul from is a pasuk by shlamim, right? Imei acha ye'acha, I'm reading the pasuk, b'sazevach shlamav, b'yam hashlishi, etc., etc. So Dafka says shlamim. So says Reb Shimon, in order for a korban to be chayiv for pigul, it would have to be a korban whose blood is thrown on the mizbeach achitzon like a korban shlam. Of course, the blood of a korban shlam is thrown on the mizbeach achitzon, shtayim shein arba. So says Reb Shimon, pigul, which is learned out from a pasuk that's talking about korban shlamim, is only shaykh to korbanis whose blood is thrown on the outer mizbeach like a shlamim, as opposed to chatos aprimios, whose blood is thrown on the inner mizbeach. So therefore, according to Reb Shimon, there would be no pigul by chatos aprimios. So now says the Gemara, Omar Ula, kometz pigul shehelo al gabi mizbeach poka pigulo mimenu shish imacher mevi lidei pigul hu atzmo lo kol sheken shish. Let's read that again. Wow. Okay, so says Ula, Amar Ula, kometz pigul. If you have a kometz pigul, what does that even mean? I assume what that means is that, well, you have a korban mincha and you take a fistful of it. Okay. And when you take that fistful from the korban mincha, you say, I'm going to eat this korban mincha tomorrow. And that's too late. So the korban, the mincha, is pigul. And I think that it sounds like we're referring to the kometz itself as a kometz that is pigul. And I guess posel as pigul. But it says, Ula, that something remarkable happens when you go up to the top of the mizbeach with that kometz. What happens? Ula kometz pigul. This kometz from this mincha that's pigul, shehelo al gabi mizbeach, that's brought to the top of the mizbeach, Paka pigulo mimenu. The pigul disappears. It's no longer pigul. And then he says something very interesting, which on the surface of it seems to not make any sense. Im acher maybe lidei pigul, because after all, if this kometz is going to make other things pigul, what other things that making pigul? The shiare amincha. The rest of the mincha that now can no longer be eaten by punishment of karis. Well, hu atzma lo kol shekaim. Well, then certainly it itself sounds like it's saying should be pigul, right? If the kometz makes the shiari mincha pigul, certainly it should make itself pigul, which goes against what Ula just said, because he just said that when it's brought to the top of the mizbeach, the kometz is no longer pigul. So my kamer, what exactly is he saying? So this is what he's saying. Im eino miskabel heyach mevi acherim lidei pigul. What Ula is saying is that, look, if this kometz itself is posel, and therefore if you are burning a posel kometz, well then you're not doing anything. It's posel. The burning of the kometz is posel. If the burning of the kometz is posel, then how can it affect anything else? We're saying that by burning the kometz, right, you scoop up the kometz with your fist, You say, I'm going to eat the Shari Mincha tomorrow. And then, of course, as we know, it only becomes pigul once you burn it. And you burn this kometz, and now the Shari Mincha becomes pigul. If you eat it, you're going to be chayiv kares. But if we're saying that the kometz itself is pasul, then that means that the burning of the kometz is pasul. Then how is it doing anything to anything? The burning of the kometz was pasul. So therefore, Ula argues it must be that actually when the kometz is brought to the top of the mizbeach, it's no longer pigul, so that when you burn it, it's a kosher burning of a kometz, but because you had that initial intention of, I'm going to eat the shari mincha tomorrow, the shari mincha becomes pigul, but the burning itself must have been a kosher burning, because if it was pasul, then how can it make anything else? How can it affect the status of anything else? The burning itself was pasul, so rather it must be that the kometz is no longer pigul, and therefore, when it's burned, it can make other things pigul. Fine. My komashma lon. So now the Gemara wants to know, how does this play out in practice? It's a little bit subtle. It's a little bit tricky because, meaning it's just kind of understand exactly what he's saying. Meaning Ula had said, so you have this kometz, and you had taken the fistful, and you said, hey, I'm going to eat the mincha. I'm going to eat the mincha tomorrow. So the mincha becomes pigul. Okay, we're saying that the kometz itself is pasul. Now, what exactly, if you have a pasul kometz, then what exactly would you what would be the nafkamina of that? And now we're saying that the kometz is kosher, so what exactly is kosher? So ein chayav an olav mishum pigul. Okay, so meaning if what we're saying is, now that this kometz is no longer pigul, it means that if you eat the kometz, you won't be chayav kares. Right? Okay? So Ula is saying that now that the kometz is no longer pigul, so if you eat it, then you won't be chayiv kares. The thing is, tanina. We already know that from our Mishnah. That was literally the first example in our Mishnah of things that you're not chayiv kares for pigul. Elu dvarim she'ein chayiv nolei mishum pigul. These are the things that you would not be chayiv kares for eating them as pigul. HaKometz, literally the first one on the list is the kometz. The aktoris, incense, valavona, frankincense, uminchas ka'anim, the mincha of a kohen, which is entirely burnt, uminchas kohen Mashiach, the minchas chavitin, also which is entirely burnt, uminchas nesachim, there's a girsa which says so you can skip that, ve'adam, and blood. So anyway, so I don't need Ula to tell me that you're not going to be chayiv kares for eating the kometz. I already know that you're not going to be chayiv kares for eating the kometz. From our Mishnah. Eladim alu lo yerdu. So maybe what Ula is saying is that, what it means is that once the kometz is put on the fire of the mizbeach, you don't need to take it down from the mizbeach. When you have this kometz that was pigul, you can leave it on top of the mizbeach. But tanina, that we also know from a Mishnah. Halon, a korban that went all night without being burnt in the mizbeach, v'ayotzer, or a korban that was taken out of the azara, v'atamei, or that became tamei, v'shenishchat chutz lizmano, pigul, a korban that's pigul, v'chutz limkomo, or outside of its proper intention of chutz limkomo, outside of its proper place. Im alu lo yerdu, if they were put on the mizbeach, you don't take them down. So we already know from that Mishnah that pigul, once it's on the mizbeach, you leave it there. So again, I don't need Ula to tell me that this kometz is no longer pigul, and therefore you could leave it on the mizbeach. I know that already. Veladim yerdu yalu. So rather what it means, what Ula is saying, is that if this kometz was put on top of the mizbeach, but then it somehow fell off of the mizbeach or came down from the mizbeach, well, we're saying that, it's no longer pigul, put it back on top of the mizbeach. It's all good. Put it back on top. But hanami tanina delo, you have to add the word delo. But we also have a Mishnah, we have a Mishnah though that says that you can't. That if that if this kometz would have gone down from the mizbeach, you would not put it back on top of the mizbeach. Right? We learned in Mishnah im alu lo yerdu, just like if they were put on the mizbeach, they would not be taken down. Kachim yerdu lo yailu. Well, if they came down from the mizbeach, leave them there. Don't put them on top. Right? Meaning, just like we say, once these things that we say you could leave on top of the mizbeach, once they're there, leave them. Well, the same thing also. If they come down from the mizbeach, leave them. Don't put them back up. So lo tzricha shemash lo b'nei or. Well, it's talking about where the fire has already taken hold of the kometz. Once the fire has taken hold of the kometz, meaning if the kometz was put on top of the mizbeach and the fire took hold of the kometz, well then if it came down from the mizbeach, it would be considered like the mizbeach already kind of like consumed it, and you could put it back on top. Hanami amar ula chadazim. The thing is, Ula already said this once before. Why does he have to say it again? Right? I mean, what's he saying now? He's saying, right, in our Gemara, he had said that if you have this kometz of, right, that was Pigul. So we're saying that it's no longer considered, once you bring it to the top of the mizbech, it's no longer considered Pigul. What's the nafkamina? Well, if after you burn it, it comes off the mizbech, you could put it back on, it's no longer Pigul, you put it back on top. But Ula already said this. Damar Ula says, Ula, lo shanu ela shelo mashlo b'nei or, when we say, says Ula, that if, let's say this, right, Pigul was on top of the mizbech and then came down, don't put it back on top. That's only if the fire has not taken hold of it. Aval mashlo b'nei or, if the fire has taken hold of it, yailu, you could put it back on top. So this also we already know from Ula, that when you have Pigul, in our context, this kometz, that you put on top of the mizbeach, and the entire fire took hold of it, even if it came down from the mizbeach, you could put it back on top. So ma'udetema nemile aver de mechaber. Yeah, the thing is, from the first statement of Ula, I may have thought that he was specifically talking about a limb, for example. Right? If you have Pigul, for example, that right, from an animal, and you're talking about a limb that was on top of the mizbeach and it came down from the mizbeach, you could put it back on if the fire had already taken hold of it. That's talking about a limb, which is one unit. It's a limb, it's a solid. Have a kometz the mifras, but a kometz, which is flour, it's not really connected to the same extent. It's more piecey. So emalo. So I might think that even if the fire already taken hold of part of the kometz, if the other part just kind of breaks apart, so then you would not put it back on top of the mizbeach, because the kometz itself is not really like a solid unit. It's already considered something that's piecey, so the part that took hold is not necessarily the part that fell off. Kamash Malon, what Ula is teaching is that even when it comes to a kometz, if part of it falls off in the mizbeach, you could put it back on top of the mizbeach, so long as at the time that it fell off, part of the fire had already taken hold on part of the kometz. Amar Rab Achai, says Rab Achai Hilkach, therefore, Hai kometz Pigul. Therefore, when it comes to a kometz of Pigul, okay, so a person took a fistful of a korb mincha, he said, I'm going to eat it tomorrow. Dipalge mochis ha'ara, that half of the kometz is on the floor, ufalge aske ha'mayrocha, and the other half is on the mizbeach, burning. Umash leboa, or and the fire takes hold of the part that's on the mizbeach, masik nalei nuchule lichatchila. Well, you could just take up the other half that was on the floor and bring it to the top of the mizbeach, right? Meaning, if we're saying that if we're going based on what Ula said, that you have this mincha, which inherently is a less solid thing, right? You have this fistful of a mincha, which is kind of crummy. And we're saying that even though it's not like a solid, but so long as the fire has taken part of the kometz, if let's say the other half of it, if half of it falls on the floor, you could bring it back to the top of the mizbeach. So even though we're talking about something that's like kind of piecey, so long as the fire is taken hold of one part of the kometz. The other part of the kometz can be brought on top of the mizbeach. So it says Rav Achai that even if you had, let's say, divided the kometz in half, brought one half to the top of the mizbeach, burnt that, and the other half was on the floor, you could just take that to the top of the mizbeach, because we see that when it comes to kometz, which is like already piecey, if one piece is on the floor, you could bring it to the top of the mizbeach, so long as the fire is already taken hold by the part that's on the mizbeach. So even if part of the kometz is literally just on the floor, no problem, take it to the top of the mizbeach and burn it there, so long as the fire has taken hold of the part of the kometz that was already on the mizbeach. Hapigul v'anoser v'atamei. Okay. Shehed lo negabi mizbeach poko iser mein. Okay. When it comes to pigul, so as we saw from Ula, that when the kometz goes to the top of the mizbeach, the iser goes away. It's no longer pigul. Noser, if you have, let's say, the meat of a korban that was left overnight and not burnt in the mizbeach, and then it was taken to the top of the mizbeach, its iser goes away, and if somebody ends up eating it, he will not be chayiv kares. And also, if you have a korban that became tamei and was brought to the top of the mizbeach, it would no longer be tamei. Amr Rav Chizda says, Rav Chizda, Mari Dichi Mizbeach Mikveh Taira. Rav Chizda says, I don't understand. Is the Mizbeach a mikveh? You take tamei meat, you bring it to the top of the Mizbeach, it's tahor. It's as though it's like the mikveh, it's like the Mizbeach is a mikveh. Rav Chizda says, is that what it is? The Mizbeach is a mikveh? Amr Bzera Shemash Labo in a or. So Bzera says, well, it's because it's talking about where the fire of the Mizbeach already kind of burned it. Matzah Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bisna. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bisna asked an interesting question. Here's his interesting question. Acherim omrim v'tumaso olav misha tuma parachas menu yotza basar shen tuma parachas menu v'misa arei tuma parachas menu idea or. Have you heard the question? It's a gewaltige kasha. This relates to a pasuk. I'm going to read you two psukim right now. The first pasuk is V'abasar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo yochel v'esh yisaref. That any meat that becomes tamei, you can't eat it. You have to burn it. V'abasar kol tar yochel basar. You have to be pure in order to eat kodashim meat. Now, here's the important part for us right now. That nefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlomim asher l'Hashem. Somebody who eats kodashim meat. V'tum also alav, and it is tamei. The question is, what is tamei? When it says v'tum also alav, again, if a person eats kodashim meat, v'tum also alav, and well, it either means and he is tamei, or it is tamei. Which one is it? That's what we're trying to figure out. Is it that? Are we talking about a person who is tamei, who eats tahor kodashim meat is chayiv kares, or are we saying that a person who is tahor, who eats tamei kodashim meat is chayiv kares? What's the pasuk talking about? So on that, so again, Masav Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bisna, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bisna asks the question, Acherim open that Acherim come to answer this question, and their answer is V'tum also olav, that when the pasuk says, I'm reading from the pasuk, "Va'nefesh shetocha basum zevach Hashem asher l'Hashem v'tumaso olav mishatuma porachas mimenu." When it says, if a person eats this meat, this kodashim meat, v'tumaso olav, it implies v'tumaso olav, and the tumah is on it at that point. Kilu, the tumah can go away, but if a person eats tumah at a point that there is, if a person eats kodashim at a point that there is tumah, i.e. it hasn't been made to go away yet, well then he's chayiv kares. Right? Also, Allah, it implies at a point that there is tumah, implying that somehow the tumah can go away. So it says acherim misha tumah parachas mimenu. So in terms of trying to solve this question of, is this pasuk talking about a person who is tamei and eating tahor kosher meat, or a person who is tahor and eating tamei kosher meat? Well, here's the thing. Whatever is tamei needs to be able to become untamei, because we're dafka talking about a point in time where that thing is tamei. Yotza basar she'ein tuma parachas mimenu, and here's the answer. It must be talking about the person being tamei, because a person might be tamei now, but he can always go to the mikvah and become untamei. Kosher meat cannot become untamei. You can't just put kosher meat in a mikvah and it becomes tahor. So therefore, if this pasuk is talking about if somebody eats kosher meat v'tum also alav, it means, and he is tamei, he hasn't gone to the mikvah, he is tamei, and he eats kosher meat that's tahor, he's going to be chayav kares. It's not saying that the person is tahor and he eats tamei kosher meat, because again, whatever is tamei needs to be able to become tahor, and tamei kosher meat you can't just throw it in the mikvah and it becomes tahor. The thing is, here's the question: if what we're saying is that meat that's tamei, once it's put on the mizbeach, it becomes tahor, that it's a mikvah, the mizbeach is a mikvah, so what does it mean? That it must be talking about a person, because a person can go to the mikvah. It could be talking about the meat. When the meat goes on the mizbeach, it becomes tahor from the mizbeach mikvah. Again, if this is correct, that when tamei meat goes to the top of the mizbeach, it becomes tahor. Hare tuma porachas mimenu aidea or. This tamei meat, it could be talking about a person's tahor. The kodashim is tamei. You bring it to the top of the mizbeach, the fire burns it, and it becomes tahor. So it could be talking about the meat. On my Rave, aide mikvah kamina. Says Rave, well, in the pasuk, when it says v'tumaso olav, we're talking about you happen to be tamei. How could the tumah go away? Dafka through a mikvah. We're not talking about the tumah going away. The pasuk is not talking about the tumah going away by being burnt on top of mizbeach. No, the pasuk is talking about the tumah going away through a mikvah. Mid mikvah ksiv. The Gemara says, well, the pasuk doesn't say anything about a mikvah. It says that you tamei right now, the tumah can go away. I don't care if it's through a mikvah. I don't care if it's through burning on top of the mizbeach. So Elam or Apopis, or Apopis is a gavaldiga answer. Bibsar shlamim maskinan. So chazil akrava. Apopis says, whoa, people, one second. What's the pasuk talking about? Says Apopis. But it says in the pasuk what it's talking about. It says, "V'nefesh shogal pasuk mizevach shlamim." Talking about a korban shlamim. So we're talking about a korban shlamim, and it says v'tumaso olav. We're saying that whatever is tamei, whether it's the person, whether it's the meat, it has to be able to become untamei. We're saying, well, a person could become untamei, it goes to the mikvah. We're suggesting, well, maybe the meat can become untamei by burning it. The thing is, we're talking about a shlamim. The meat of a shlamim is not going to be burned on the mizbech. It's going to be eaten by the kohanim or by the owners, and therefore, to say that maybe it's talking about the meat because the meat can be burnt on the mizbech, the meat of a shlamim is not burned on the mizbech. It's divided among the kohanim and the owners, and therefore the pasuk simply can't be talking about the meat. It's talking about a person. Ravina Amar says, Ravina, yeah, but the thing is, by a korban shlamim, the emurim are burnt on the mizbeach. So, it could be talking about the emurim. So, v'tum also olav misha tuma parachas mimenu kishu shalim. So it says Ravina, look, this is how you know it's talking about a person who's tamei rather than the kodashim meat that's tamei, because it says v'tumaso alav misha tuma parachas mimenu kishu shalim alav, on it. it as a complete entity, and shetum also alav, that the tumah is on it, and also that the tumah can go away from it while it is still whole. A person is tamei. The person as a whole jumps into a mikvah, he becomes tahor. The meat, however, when it's burned on the mizbeach, if we're saying that the mizbeach is a mikvah, but the meat, when it's put on the mizbeach, it's not whole. It's hacked up in pieces when it's put on the mizbeach. Or at least even, or at least certain parts have been, it was right. It's not going to be whole, right? Either we're just talking about the imurim when it goes on the mizbeach, or it's talking about, even if we're talking about a ola that's entirely burnt, but it's going to be cut up into pieces. It's also missing its hide. Yotza basar davar she'ein tuma parachas kishushal melik shuchaser. However, when it comes to meat, even if you say that meat going on the mizbeach would become tahor, this pasuk cannot be talking about the meat because it says v'tumasu alav, something that its purification, it's tamei on it, also its tamei will go away from it while it's whole, which therefore must be referring to a person who jumps into mikvah, rather than meat that goes in the mizbeach where it's already either only part of it's going in the mizbeach or it's already been cut up into smaller pieces. So therefore, that pasuk is not talking about the kodashim meat; it's talking about the person who is tamei. So the pasuk is saying that if you have a person who is tamei and eats kodashim meat that's tahor, they will be chayav kares. So now we had just seen one opinion, the opinion of Acherim, in terms of how to understand that pasuk. How do we know that pasuk, which is either talking about a tamei person eating tahor kodashim meat, or a tahor person eating tamei kodashim meat, right? Is it the person who's tamei, or is it the meat that's tamei? So we saw the opinion of the Acherim, who says v'tumah. So all of it's talking about a person who is tamei but can go to the mikvah. We're now going to see several other opinions for how to arrive at that same conclusion, that the pasuk is talking about a person who is tamei. So Gufa, we said earlier, v'tumah also olav, that when the pasuk says, and either he is tamei or it is tamei, betumas aguf hakasu medaber, the answer is we are talking about a person who is tamei. Ataomer betumas aguf or inuela betumas basar. Wait, how do you know it's talking about the person who is tamei? Maybe it's the meat that's tamei. So nemer kan tum also v'nemer l'halon tum also ba. Well, here is the thing, says the Brisa, that it says tum also over here by either by either a Torah person eating tamei meat or a tamei person eating Torah meat. So achila betuma, achilas kodashim betuma, and it also says tum also by a tamei person who goes into the Beis HaMikdash. Malaholon betumas hagufa kosu medaber. Just like over there, it's talking about a tamei person who goes into the Beis HaMikdash. So afkan betumas hagufa kosu medaber. So here also we're talking about a tamei person who, in this case, instead of going to the Beis HaMikdash, we're talking about where he eats tahor kodashim meat. So we're talking about the person being tamei. Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi, ho v'nemru kodashim b'loshen rabim, v'nemru tumah b'loshen yochid, b'tumah segova kosu medaber. Rabbi Yossi says something very interesting, which is that if you look at the pasuk, it says, v'nefesh shetochal b'ozim zevach shlomim. Shlomim is plural. Asher la'Hashem v'tumaso alav, and tumah is on him, singular. So if it was talking about the meat, it was already referring to the meat in plural. It should be saying v'tumaso alehem or whatever. It should be plural, right? If we're saying shlomim. Shlomim is plural. So all descriptors of the meat should also be plural, but it's not. It's singular, which means it's not talking about the meat. It's talking about the person is tamei. Very interesting shita. Let's read that again. Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi, hol v'nemru kodashim b'loshen rabim, since shlomim, right, since the meat, the kodashim meat, is referenced in plural, shlomim, v'nemru tumah b'loshen yachid, and the tumah, v'tumaso alav, is b'loshen yachid, is singular. So v'tumas haguf hakasu medaber means that v'tumaso alav is not talking about the kodashim, it's talking about the person. V'tumas haguf, it's talking about the person being tamei. Rabbi Omer, Rebbe has a very interesting shita which we are going to unpack momentarily. V'ochal, that if you look at the very next pasuk, right? We just read Sefer Vayikra Perek Zayin pasuk Chaf. We had also read pasuk Yutes earlier. The very next pasuk, Perek Zayin pasuk Chaf Aleph, says, "V'nefesh kisiga b'chol tamei," that a person who touches tumah and becomes tamei, b'tumas adam or b'beima tamei or b'chol sheketz tamei, v'ochal mi b'sar zevach hashlamim asher l'Hashem v'nichsar nefesh ha'oyu me'amel. And this tamei person eats korbanis, is going to be chayav kares. So we see that this very next pasuk is talking about a tamei person eating kodashim. So we want to say that just like the next pasuk is talking about a tamei person, so also our pasuk is talking about a tamei person. Now the Gemara is going to ask, like, I don't understand, why just because the next pasuk is talking about a tamei person, why does it mean that this pasuk is talking about a tamei person? But anyways, so Rabbi Omer again says, Rabbi, v'ochal, that when the next pasuk talks about the person who's tamei and eating kodashim, so we're talking about the person being tamei. B'tumas haguf v'kodashim v'daber, we're talking about the person being tamei. Acherim omrim, says acherim v'tumas olav, as you saw earlier, that he eats the kodashim when the tumah is on him temporarily. Misha tumah parachas v'menu, somebody whose tumah can go away. Yotza basar shein tumah parachas v'menu, to the exclusion of meat, since the meat, the tumah won't go away from the meat. Omar, we said earlier, Rabbi Omer says, Rabbi v'achol b'tumas haguf akosum medaber. Okay. So Rebbe had said, if you look at the very next pasuk, it's talking about the person, right? V'nefesh kisiga b'chol tamei b'tumas adam ovim b'tamei choshek es tamei v'acham b'sazev. It's talking about the person. So since the next pasuk is talking about the person, so our pasuk is also talking about tumas haguf, the person being tamei. So again, Omar Mar, we said, Rabbi Omer says, Rabbi, that the next pasuk says v'achal b'tumas haguf akosum medaber, that the next pasuk which talks about the person eating means that we're talking about the person being tamei. My mashma. How come? How come? Because the next pasuk is talking about a person being tamei. What does that have to do with our pasuk? That doesn't mean that our pasuk is talking about a person being tamei. So Omar Rava says, Rav Kol Krad Lo Mefarish Le Rav Yitzchak Bar Avudimi. Any verse that is not expounded, that is not explained by Rav Yitzchak Bar Avudimi, v'chomas nisa d'lo mefarsha zeiri, or any brisa not explained by zeiri, lo mefarsha, is as good as not explained. Okay? So what's this verse that's masterfully explained by Rav Yitzchak Bar Avudimi? Hachi Amar Yitzchak Bar Avudimi, says of Yitzchak Bar Avudimi, Hoil ufasach hakasav b'lashon nekeva v'siyim b'lashon nekeva v'lashon zocher be'emtza b'tumas haguf hakasav medaber. Very, very interesting. Says of Yitzchak Bar Avudimi, if we look at this next pasuk, Vayikra Perek Zayin pasuk Chaf Aleph, it says, V'nefesh kisiga b'chol tamei. So v'nefesh kisiga, tiga is female. V'nefesh ki tiga is female. B'chol tamei b'tumas adam or b'heima tamei or b'sheketz tamei. V'ochal, now v'ochal is male. Mibsa zevach hasham Hashem Hashem v'nichrisa. Nichrisa is once again female. Hanefesh me'amel. So interesting. This next pasuk. So what we're saying is that this next pasuk has an interesting structure to it. Female, male, female. And it's talking about what? It's talking about the person who's eating. The person becomes tamei and eats kodashim. Well, guess what? In our pasuk also it has that same structure. It says Vanefesh asher tochal basar, female. Mizevach Hashem shel Hashem v'tumaso a love is male. V'nichsa nefesh ai, once again, v'nichsa female, male. So the proof is not simply that, well, since the next pasuk is talking about the person, so our pasuk is also talking about the person. No, it's much deeper than that. It's that if you analyze the structure of the next pasuk, which is talking about the person, it starts female, goes male, goes back to female, and it's talking about the person the whole time. Even though it starts female and then goes male, back to female, it's talking about the person the whole time. Well, guess what? If you look at our verse as well, the same thing is going on. Meaning, if you're going to come to and say to me, and try to make the argument that, look, it says, that's female, v'tumaso a love, that's male, so how could that be referring to the person? The person we said is female. This is male. It's talking about the meat. No. Because the next pasuk has the same structure. Female, male, female, and it's talking about a person. Here also, our pasuk 2 starts female, goes male, back to female. It's talking about the person. That is Rebbe's proof from the next pasuk. That from the structure of the next pasuk, we look at our pasuk and say, wait, it's the same structure. Our pasuk is also talking about male. It is also talking about the person. So again, since the next pasuk starts female, and ends female, with male in the middle, and the whole thing is talking about the person who eats the kodashim. So therefore we can learn about our verse as well, which starts female, then goes male, and back to female. It's talking about the person who is tamei in our pasuk as well. So now, after having shared with us what the scenario where Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi so masterfully explained the verse, what is the scenario where Zeiri masterfully explains a brisa? Masnisa, the brisa is the sanya that we learn in a brisa. Im nemru kalos lamanemru chamuris. Okay. If the lenient ones were said, then why were the stringent ones said? If the chamuris were said, why were the kalas said? This is why we're going to have to require Zeiri to explain what in the world we're talking about. If it had only said kalas, the lenient ones, but not the stringent ones, says the brisa, I would say for the lenient ones, you would be liable for a lav, a mitzvah slosa say, v'lachamuris b'misa. And the chamuris would be a chiyuv misa, l'chachnemer chamuris, therefore it says the chamuris, apparently to say that the chamuris are also a lav. If it only said the chamuris, v'lemru kalas, and not the kalas, I would say, la chamuris ye'chayv, they're chayv for the chamuris, v'la kalas li'e potter, and you're potter for the kalos. Therefore it says kalos to say you're not potter for the kalos. My kalos, my chamuris, what are we talking about? Lenient things, stringent things, if it only said the lenient, if it only said the stringent, what are we talking about? My kalos, my chamuris, what's the lenient things, what's the stringent things? Ile makalos, meiser chamuris, terumah. Okay, how about this? Kalos, the lenient ones, are meiser, and the stringent ones are terumah. And we're saying that if a tamei person eats, the kalos are meiser, right? So if a tamei person eats kalos, meiser, so it would be a lav. And if he eats chamuris, terumah, he's going to be chayiv misa. And we're saying that if it only said meiser but not terumah, so then I would assume that if a tamei person eats terumah, there would be misa b'dei shamayim. Now the strange thing though is that then it says, okay, but since it says terumah, then what? It's not chayiv misa b'dei shamayim, but it is chayiv misa b'dei shamayim. So let's see. So I see omer b'misa, right? So if we're saying that if it only said, right, if it only said meiser and it didn't say terumah, I see omer b'misa. So if it only said meiser, it didn't say terumah, I would have said that a tamei person who eats truma is chayv misa b'dei shamayim, but ashanami misa. But that is the halacha, right? A tamei person eats truma is chayv misa b'dei shamayim. So like it says meiser and it says truma, and he is chayv misa b'dei shamayim. V'su, and more so, v'ilo nemru ha'isi omer b'misa. And also, what's weird about that is that we're saying, okay, if it only said meiser and it didn't say truma, I would say meiser is a lav, but truma is misa b'dei shamayim. But why? If essentially we're saying that truma would be learned from meiser, well then it should have the halach for learning from meiser. Well, if you're learning something from somewhere else, it should take on the halachos of the place where it's learning from. I.e., if we're saying that truma is being learned from meiser, well, just like meiser is a lav, truma should also be a lav, not misa. So it should be a lav, not misa. Okay, what is going on over here? This is kind of messy. Elakalos tumas sheretz chamuras tumas meis. Okay, how about this? Kalos is if a person, we're talking about somebody who's tamei with only tumas sheretz versus chamura is somebody who's tamei tumas meis. Okay, uvimai. Okay, and what's this tamei person doing? Ibit truma. Okay, maybe it's talking about truma. Okay, so we're talking about a tamei person is eating truma. Okay, and if it only said, wait, what are we saying? Ibit truma. So if we're talking about, if it only said that a person who's tamei tumas sheretz who eats truma, but why are we saying it would be a lav though? Anybody who eats truma, that would be b'misa, right? So idi v'idi b'misa, right? Even a person who's tamei tumas sheretz who eats truma, it's a chiyuv misa. V'su, right? Misa b'dei shamayim. V'su and more so. L'chach nemar chamuris deb'lava b'misa he. Right? L'chach nemar chamuris deb'lav. I'm sorry. L'chach nemar chamuris deb'lav b'misa. But also it doesn't make sense because it's saying, so if it only said kalos, which is saying it's tumas sheretz, and it didn't say chamurus, which is tumas ames, I would say that tumas ames is b'misa. But now that it says tumas ames, it's only a lab. That's not true. It's also misa. Any tamei person who eats truma, it's chiv misa b'dei shamayim. So like, why would we be saying that somebody who's tamei tumas sheretz who eats truma is a lav? It's not true. It's chiv misa b'dei shamayim. And why are we saying that right now that it says misa it says tumas ames, we're saying that it's a lav again. It's misa b'dei shamayim. V'bachilas meiser. Okay, so maybe it's talking about meiser. Okay, so you have a person who's tamei tumas sheretz eating meiser versus somebody who's tamei tumas ames eating meiser. But either way, it's only going to be a lav. Imlo nemru chamurus ha'isi omer ala chamurus b'misa. So why are we saying that if it only said somebody who's tamei tumas sheretz who eats meiser, it would be a lav, and then we say, and I would assume that somebody who eats meiser with tamei tumas ames would be misa b'dei shamayim. But why? Tumas sheretz cause. If we're learning out from tumas sheretz, v'dari lavam adin lios kanidon, it should be like tumas sheretz. It should be a lav. Omar Iziri. Okay, fine. Friends, here comes the Iri to kind of explain what the heck is going on, because this is insane. Like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about meiser? Are we talking about truma? Are we talking about sheretz? Are we talking about tumas ames? What are we talking about? What's kal? What's chamer? What's going on here? So Omar Ziri says Ziri kalos tumas sheretz. Okay, so it says Ziri kalos lenient is tumas sheretz. Chamur is tumas ames. Chamur is tumas ames. Okay. This is pshat. Ilu nemar tumas sheretz. Okay. If it had only said tumas sheretz, v'nemar meiser v'truma, and it also said meiser and truma, i.e., if it had only said, okay, so you have a person who's tamei tumas sheretz, and he eats meiser, so it'll be a lab. If he eats truma, of course, it'll be misa b'dei shamayim. V'lo nemar tumas ames, and if it didn't say anything about tumas ames, well, then I'd have to draw my own conclusions about tumas ames. And you know what I'd say? Well, my conclusion is this. Okay, A sheretz, which is kal, who eats meiser, which is kal, is a lav. A sheretz, which is kal, and eats terumah, which is chomer, it's b'misa b'dei shamayim. So, if I have to draw my own conclusions about tumas hameis, I'll say, well, when it comes to tumas hasheretz, which is kal, and he eats terumah, which is chomer, so you have the combo of kal and chomer, we're saying is misa b'dei shamayim, so then I would think that somebody who's tamei tumas hameis, which is chomer, and eats meiser, which is kal, so again, you have this kal and chomer scenario, I would say that it's also misa b'dei shamayim, right? Just like a tamei tuma person who's tamei tumas hasheretz eats terumah is misa b'dei shamayim, so I would think that somebody who's tamei tumas haguf, tumas hameis, who eats meiser, should also be chayiv misa b'dei shamayim. I would say kalos ala kalos. When you have lenient on lenient, tumas hasheretz eating meiser bilav, it's only a lav. V'ala chamuras b'misa, and you have sheretz eating terumah, it's misa b'dei shamayim. Umidekalis ala chamuros b'misa, and I would say that, and just like the lenient with the stringent is misa b'dei shamayim, somebody tamei tumas hasheretz who eats terumah is misa b'dei shamayim. Chamuros ala kalos b'misa. I would also say that the inverse is also true. Somebody who's tamei tumas hameis, which is chomer, who eats meiser, which is kal, also b'misa. Chachnemu chamuros. That is why we had to also know about tamei tumas hameis in order to say that no, actually, somebody who's tamei tumas hameis but is eating meiser, it won't be misa b'dei shamayim. It will be just a lav. Chevre, that was Daf Mem Gimel of Masechta Zevachim. On Daf Mem Gimel of Masechta Zevachim, we began with a Mishnah that discussed all sorts of Pigul exceptions, kometz, Torres, Livona, etc. All sorts of Pigul exceptions. The principle being that you will be chayiv kares for eating Pigul when we're talking about something that is permitted. Something like meat or the emurim that are burnt on the mizbeach. We then saw the opinion of Ula, who says that a kometz, once it's brought to the mizbeach, onto the mizbeach, it's no longer Pigul. We said, what's the difference? The difference is that, well, if you burn it on the mizbeach and then it becomes consumed by the fire, the fire takes hold of it and then part of it falls off of the mizbeach, you could bring it back on to the top of the mizbeach. We talked about a tamei person eating kosher meat, right? We saw those psukim by a person who's tamei eating tahor or kosher meat, but that wasn't so simple, right? We thought maybe it could be a tahor person eating tamei meat. And then we had a few different opinions. We had the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, we had the Tanakama, we had Rebbe, we had Acherim, with different views on how we know that it's in fact talking about a tamei person who eats tahor, kosher meat. Along the way, as part of explaining the opinion of Rebbe, we had this interesting statement, which is that we need Rav Yitzchak bar Vudimi to teach us psukim and Ziri to teach us brises, and we explained what's a pasuk that we needed Rav Yitzchak bar Vudimi to explain to us, and that was the pasuk by a tamei person who's eating tahor kodashim. And then we got to a brisa explained by Zeiri that when you have a tamei person who eats terumah and meiser, so a tamei person eating meiser, regardless of if the person is tamei tumas hasheretz or tumas hameis, it is only going to be a lav. And when you have a tamei person, regardless of if it's tamei tumas hasheretz or tamei tumas hameis, who eats terumah, it's going to be misa b'dei shamayim. Chevre, that was Daf Mem Gimel of Masechta Zevachim. I hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Cheers.